first she thought it was a dead puppy, curled up in a patch of cold mud, barely a twitch in the leg. No sound, no breath she could see, just a lump of fur, soaked and limp. Sandra froze. She had been checking the fence line that morning, trying to see where the damn deer kept slipping in. Her boots were caked in last night's rain, and her jacket stuck to her back. The field was quiet, except for a few starlings kicking at the thawed earth. Then she saw it. A dark clump in the middle of the pasture. Too big for a rabbit. Too small for anything that should have been there. Sandra walked closer, slow, every step squelching. 10 feet away she stopped. The shape was covered in dirt and matted hair. Paw stuck out. Not a puppy. A bear cub. Jesus Christ. She looked around. No mother. No blood. No sign of a fight. Just the cub, shaking now, barely noticeable. She crouched. Its eyes were crusted shut. Breathing shallow. A soft wheeze with every exhale. Ribcage like wire under its skin. Maybe 2 months old, maybe less. Bones more than body. She should have called someone. The ranger station. Wildlife services. Anyone. But instead, she whispered, "Shit." Took off her jacket and wrapped it around the cub. It didn't fight. Didn't even flinch. Sandra held it to her chest. It was cold. Cold like something already gone. Back at the house, she cleared the kitchen table in one swipe, pushed the mail, a loaf of bread, an empty coffee mug onto the floor. She laid the cub down and turned on the stove, set a kettle, grabbed towels. Her hands moved without thinking. She rubbed its fur with warm water, cleaned the crust from its nose, dried it. The little thing didn't move, didn't make a sound. Every 5 minutes she checked its chest. Still rising, still falling. She crushed up an egg yolk in goat milk, tried to feed it with a syringe. Most of it ran down its chin, but a few drops slid in. It swallowed. "Okay," she muttered. "Okay, damn it." By noon, it was still breathing. She had the wood stove cranked up to hell, and the cub lay bundled in a towel, beside her own bed now. She watched it for hours, never took her eyes off it. She didn't name it, didn't stroke it or whisper sweet things. It wasn't a pet, wasn't even her problem. But she couldn't put it back outside either. Just after sunset, it made a sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a cry. Something broken, like a rusty hinge in the wind. Sandra stood there, arms folded, biting her lip hard. That sound, it crawled under her skin. "God damn it," she said to the empty room. "What the hell have I done?" By midnight, the little bear had vomited twice and pissed itself 3 times. Its whole body shook in waves, like something was trying to crawl out of its skin. Sandra hadn't sat down once. She called Dr. Kelman around 1 in the morning. He picked up, groggy. "I found a bear cub," she said, skipping pleasantries. "It's in bad shape. Starving. I need help." A pause. Then, "You're kidding, right?" "I'm not." "You're out of your mind," he snapped. "That's illegal, Sandra. And dangerous." "I don't care. It's dying. Put it back where you found it." She hung up. The cub let out a whimper. Then its whole body tensed. Legs stiff, jaw clenched, and a second later it was seizing. Sandra dropped to the floor beside it, hands shaking. She didn't know what to do. There wasn't a goddamn manual for this. She held its head gently, kept it from hitting the floor, watched it ride the storm. 10 seconds, then 20. Then it stopped, breathing again, barely. Sandra sat there, back against the bed frame, staring at the ceiling. She hadn't felt that kind of helplessness since the night her sister died. 18 years ago, the hospital hallway, the sounds of machines flatlining, her mother's screaming, the way no one would look her in the eye, that same cold air in her chest now. She looked at the cub, his paws twitching in sleep or in pain, she couldn't tell. She whispered, "You don't get to die too." At sunrise, the seizures had stopped. The cub still hadn't stood, but it opened one crusty eye and turned its head when she entered the room. She stopped in her tracks. "You see me?" It blinked, then let out a tiny, scratchy sound, like a hiccup from a cracked speaker. She sat slowly on the floor, holding a warm towel soaked in milk and egg again. This time, when she pressed it to the cub's lips, it licked once. Then again. Not much, but something. She leaned back, stared at it. "You stubborn little shit." The room stank. The towels were ruined. Her back ached, but the cub was alive. Around noon, she opened the front door just to let some air in. The valley was bright, too bright, as if the world didn't give a damn what was dying in her bed. Back inside, She lowered herself onto the edge of the mattress and rubbed her eyes. This wasn't just a bear. This was something else now. A choice. A weight. A line she'd crossed. The cub coughed again, then turned its head toward her, its eyes half open, and she swore. She swore. It moved closer when she spoke again. "Yeah," she said, voice hoarse. "I see you too." 3 days later, the cub was walking. Not well. Its legs wobbled like wet sticks, and it tipped over more than once. But it moved. It followed Sandra from room to room, pausing every few steps to rest its head on the floor like it was too heavy to carry. She didn't let it outside. Not yet. Too cold at night. Too risky. But on the 4th day, just before noon, the cub slipped past her boots when she opened the back door. It stumbled out into the yard. No leash, no cover, nothing. Sandra cursed and ran after it, towel in hand. But she wasn't fast enough. "Hey!" The voice came from behind the fence. Shit, Gregory, her nearest neighbor, retired trucker, owned 2 ATVs and a shotgun he liked too much. He stood at the property line, arms crossed, mouth curled. "What the hell is that?" Sandra froze. The cub sniffed the ground near the chicken coop. "It's not what you think," she said. "That a bear?" She didn't answer. He stepped closer. "You want to get someone killed? It's just a baby. It's a goddamn bear, Sandra. You want its mama sniffing around here? Want it tearing through my place? I'm handling it." "No, you're not. You're keeping a predator in a goddamn backyard." The cub looked up at the noise, then sat down. Tired already, Gregory shook his head. "I'm telling the others." She didn't stop him. By evening, the phone rang 5 times. No one left a message. Her texts lit up with things like, "Is it true? You lost your mind? Call me now." At the store the next morning, 2 women in the bread aisle whispered loud enough for her to hear. "I heard it's in her house. She's lost it." Totally snapped. On the walk back, her chest felt tight. Not fear, not shame, just rage boiling slow and steady. She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't planned to become the town weirdo. That afternoon, the call came from the Forestry Service. "This is Officer Randall, ma'am. We got a report of an illegal wildlife situation at your property." Sandra stood in her kitchen, the cub asleep in a laundry basket behind her. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "I need to schedule a visit. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. She hung up without saying goodbye. That night, she moved the cub into the root cellar, laid down blankets, brought food, stayed with it for an hour, rubbing its back as it slept. "You stay quiet tomorrow, you hear?" she whispered. "Just for one damn day." The next morning, she made coffee like nothing was wrong, opened all the windows, put out a pie for God's sake. When Officer Randall knocked, she smiled like a woman with nothing to hide. And deep below their feet, the cub stayed silent. The cub had energy now. Not much, but enough to explore. By the end of the 2nd week, it followed Sandra like a shadow. Around the house, into the barn, even to the outhouse when she forgot to shut the door. It pawed at her boots, chewed on chair legs, knocked over a bowl of potatoes without an ounce of guilt. It was still quiet, never growled, never cried, but its eyes tracked her every move. And sometimes, when she laughed at its clumsiness, it tilted its head, as if confused by the sound. One morning, it clambered onto her lap without warning, just climbed up and fell asleep on her thighs. Dead weight, no invitation, just trust. Sandra sat still for over an hour. She told herself it was just until it got strong, just until it could survive. Then she'd let it go. But she was lying to herself, and she knew it. That night the wind was restless. Fast-moving clouds, no moon. The kind of dark that creeps into your bones. Sandra left the bedroom window cracked, just a sliver for air. The cub curled up at the foot of her bed on a pile of old quilts. 2 in the morning, something growled. Low, deep, not close but not far either. Sandra's eyes snapped open. The cub didn't move, but its ears twitched. Another growl. Closer. She slid out of bed, heart hammering. Quiet as she could, she grabbed the shotgun from under the dresser, checked the chamber. Full. She crossed to the window and peered out. Nothing but trees and shadows. The barn's outline, the dark smear of the woods beyond. Then she saw it, movement near the treeline. Just for a second. A shape. Massive. She shut the window fast, turned back. The cub was sitting up now, staring. Sandra's breath came hard. She tiptoed to the front door, unlatched it, and stepped onto the porch. Silence. No wind. No crickets. No movement. Then again. A rustle. Leaves. Heavy steps. She raised the shotgun. Aimed toward the trees. Nothing came out. After 5 minutes, she lowered the barrel. Jaw clenched. Sweat down her spine. Back inside, she locked every door. Every window. In the morning, she found tracks. Big ones. Deep. Paws the size of dinner plates. Leading from the woods to the edge of her yard. Then back again. The cub sniffed them. Didn't react. Sandra stood still, arms crossed tight. "Was that your mama?" she whispered. The cub looked up, then wandered back to the porch like nothing mattered. But Sandra didn't sleep for the next 2 nights. Not really. She left the shotgun by the door, and the window stayed shut.
If you love stories about wildlife rescue, click the subscribe button below. Here's how the button looks on different devices. Every subscription helps spread these stories and raise awareness. The more people know, the more animals get the help they need. And remember, subscribing is completely free. Click subscribe now and join us in protecting wildlife.
The knock came at exactly 8. Sandra opened the door to 2 men in uniform. One in forestry green, the other in a local deputy's beige. She recognized the second one immediately. "Eli," he gave a slow nod. "Morning, Sandra." Eli Boone. Used to throw rocks at trains with her when they were 10. Hadn't seen him in years. Now he had a badge and a clipboard. The forestry officer stepped forward. "We got a report of a bear cub on the property. Mind if we look around?" Sandra leaned on the doorframe. "There's no bear here." Eli shifted his weight. "You sure about that?" "Pretty damn sure." The officer glanced past her, trying to see inside. "I can get a warrant," he said. Sandra didn't flinch. "Then come back with one." A beat. Then Eli sighed. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." "It already is." They left, but not before the officer warned her. "Next time we bring animal control. And fines. Serious ones." As soon as their truck disappeared down the road, Sandra ran to the barn. The cub was curled up in an old feed bin, hidden under straw. It blinked up at her, confused. She knelt down. "You can't be here much longer. They're not gonna stop." That afternoon, the cub chewed through the screen door, just walked straight out into the yard. Sandra caught it by the compost pile, but not before Gregory's damn dog saw it and started barking like mad. She yanked the cub back inside, slapped together a barricade with plywood and chairs. "This isn't working," she muttered. "You need space." "I know. I get it." The next day, Eli came back. Alone. He didn't knock. Just stood at the edge of her porch, hat in hand. "I'm not here official," he said. I had to see for myself." Sandra stepped outside. "Didn't invite him in." "It's still here, right?" She said nothing. He looked down. "You always had a big heart. Even when it got you hurt." Sandra's jaw clenched. "You done?" "I'm supposed to report back. Then lie." He stared at her a long time, then turned and walked away. That night, the cub escaped again. Found a loose board in the barn wall. Sandra tracked it by broken branches and muddy paw prints. She found it behind the chicken coop. Blood on its snout. One of the hens lay still, neck twisted. The cub looked up at her, blinking. Not guilty, not proud, just natural. Sandra knelt beside the hen, touched its still warm feathers. "You're not a baby anymore, are you?" she said quietly. The cub walked toward her, nuzzled her knee, and for the first time she felt afraid of it. Not because of what it did, but because it didn't understand why it mattered. Sandra didn't sleep that night, or the one after. She stayed up, sitting by the door, shotgun nearby, listening for movement outside. The chicken coop was empty now. She buried the hen herself under the old oak tree. The cub paced in the barn like something caged, scratched the walls, whined low when she wasn't there. On the 5th morning, she made a decision. By noon, she packed a blanket, a bowl of eggs, and the last of the goat milk into a crate, loaded it in the truck. The cub climbed in without protest. They drove for 30 minutes into the ridge past the river, to a clearing thick with wild raspberries. Quiet, remote. Sandra stepped out and opened the crate. The cub hesitated, looked at her, then padded out, nose twitching. She sat on a stump, watched it sniff the air, paw the ground. It found a patch of berries and started eating. No fear, no looking back. When she stood up to leave, it turned. Didn't run, didn't come closer, just watched. She wanted to say something, wanted to explain, But what could she possibly say? That she was sorry? That she didn't want to let go but had no choice? So she nodded once, turned around, got in the truck, and drove. The silence at home was unbearable. No claws on wood, no soft grunts, no bowl to fill, nothing. Every creak in the house made her turn her head. Every gust of wind sounded like a whine. A week passed. No sign, no tracks. She started doubting whether it had ever really been there. Maybe she'd lost her mind, like the town thought. Then, just after sunset on the 8th day, she heard it. Scratching. Low, steady. She opened the door, and there it was. Mud on its legs, ribs fuller, eyes alert. The cub stood on the porch, breathing hard. And behind it, another shape. Bigger. Not full-grown, but close. A second bear. Fur darker. Leaner. Male, maybe. Maybe not. Sandra froze. The cub stepped forward. The other one waited by the fence. She didn't know what to do. Her arms hung at her sides. She wanted to kneel to say its name, if it had one, but something held her in place. The cub walked past her, straight to the old water bowl by the door. Drank. Saturday. The second bear watched. Sandra exhaled. Slowly. Okay, she whispered. Okay, then. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. The cub stayed close, sleeping near the porch, wandering only as far as the barn. The second bear kept its distance. It never came close, never crossed the fence line. Just watched. Always watching. Sandra didn't sleep much. She kept the shotgun loaded and leaned by the back door. She fed the cub again. Told herself she shouldn't. Did it anyway. And then, on the 4th night, the screaming started. Tore through the valley like a blade. Sandra jumped out of bed, barefoot, shotgun in hand. She didn't bother with a jacket. Ran straight to the pasture. Moonlight lit the field just enough to see what was left. One of her cows. Dappled gray. The biggest one. Laid out flat, neck ripped open. Blood everywhere. Flies already buzzing. She dropped to her knees beside it. Tried to process the mess. Hoof prints. Claw marks. Drag lines in the dirt. And there, in the mud, 2 sets of paw prints. One small. One much larger. Her heart stopped. Behind her, a sound. The low snap of a twig. She turned, gun raised, but it was just the cub. Alone. His head low. Tail down. Not approaching. Sandra stared at it. Was this you? Did you do this? Or did you bring it here? The cub blinked. Took 1 step closer. She raised the gun higher. It froze. Saturday. Looked at her the same way it always had. Calm. Patient. Her arms dropped. Back at the house, she locked every door twice. In the morning, Gregory was already there. Standing by the fence, holding a hunting rifle. You see what happened? He asked. She nodded. You know what did it? Not for sure. He spat in the grass. Bullshit. You brought this. I let it go. Then why's it still here? Other neighbors started arriving. Word had spread. A dead cow meant panic. Meant anger. Meant people looking for someone to blame. And they looked at her. Sandra didn't argue. Didn't explain. Just stood on her porch, watching them form a loose circle, voices rising. Someone said, "We shoot both of them." Someone else, "Should have done it weeks ago." Her fingers twitched. Later that day, Eli came again. Quiet. Alone. "They're planning something," he said. "I can't stop it." Sandra nodded. "I need to do this myself," she said. "Do what?" "End it. Before they do." That night, she packed a rope, a flashlight, and a tranquilizer gun she'd borrowed 5 years ago and never returned. She didn't know if it still worked. She stepped into the trees with no real plan, just instinct, and a cold kind of certainty burning in her gut. The woods swallowed her whole. Branches clawed at her coat. The flashlight beam shook in her hand. Every sound felt like a warning. Cracking twigs, shifting leaves. She moved slowly, trying not to think. Just listen. She followed the prints. Faint in the damp earth, but there. One small set. One large. Sandra didn't know what she planned to do when she found them. Trank the bigger one? Both? What if it didn't work? What if they charged? What if... A snarl cut through the night. She froze, heart hammering. Then came the growl. Close. Deep. She crouched low behind a log. Moved the flashlight slowly, sweeping the area. And there it was. Not the cub. The larger bear. Thin. Ribs like blades. Its fur clumped with mud. And its teeth bared. Something. Sandra shifted the beam. The cub. standing between the big bear and something else. Her. She hadn't even realized she'd stepped into the clearing. She was exposed. The big one lunged. The cub threw itself sideways, snapping low to the ground. Not attacking, distracting. The bigger bear hesitated, snarled again, took a slow step. Sandra raised the tranquilizer gun, aimed for the shoulder, fired. The dart hit. The bear roared, staggered, and then bolted into the trees. She stood still, breathing like she'd run a mile, hands shaking, gun half lowered. The cub turned to her, chest heaving, eyes locked. Sandra opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Behind her, someone shouted. A single word, "There!" A shot rang out. The cub jerked sideways. Another shot. It dropped. She screamed, "No!" and ran to it, falling to her knees. Blood at the shoulder. Shallow. Breathing still there. Gregory and another man crashed through the brush, rifles up. Sandra raised both hands. "It wasn't the one. I saw it. It wasn't." Gregory hesitated. Looked down. Too late. They left. Didn't say another word. Sandra stayed there, cradling the cub's head. It blinked slowly, still watching her. She whispered, "Why'd you come back?" The cub didn't move, just looked. Then, with a shudder, it stood, blood trailing. It didn't growl, didn't whimper, just turned, and walked away, into the trees. She didn't follow, didn't call out. She sat there until dawn. She never saw it again. She'd tell herself later that it survived, that it found a cave, that it healed. But she didn't really know, and she didn't know why it had stood in front of her, why it fought for her, or if it even was about her at all. She only knew one thing. "I can't forgive what they did," she said once, months later. "But I don't know if I can forgive him either." A pause. "I don't know if he came back for me, or if he just came home."